This is what it looks like when someone who's never been held accountable tries to lie their way out on camera. November 16th, 2019. 2 million people tuned in to BBC Two that evening. What they watched wasn't an interview. It was an autopsy, performed while the patient was still talking. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, second son of Queen Elizabeth II, eighth in line to the throne, sat in a gilt-wood chair inside Buckingham Palace's south drawing room and attempted to explain why he maintained a friendship with a convicted sex offender named Jeffrey Epstein. The interview had been recorded 2 days earlier, 49 minutes of footage. And somewhere in those 49 minutes, a man who had spent 59 years being protected from consequences discovered what happens when the protection stops. Emily Maitlis didn't destroy him with aggressive questions or gotcha journalism. She did something far more devastating. She asked questions. Then she waited, and in those silences, Andrew talked himself into oblivion, one contradiction at a time, each answer building the scaffold for his own public execution. What we're going to do here is forensic. We're going to break down exactly how this disaster worked, not what the scandal was about. You already know that. What we're examining is the mechanism. How does a member of the royal family sit down for a recorded interview and leave behind something so incriminating that clips would circulate for years, accumulating tens of millions of views? How does someone fail this completely while apparently believing they're winning? The answer involves 5 specific contradiction moments, one journalist's masterful patience, and a psychological blind spot so vast that an entire lifetime of privilege couldn't see around it. Let's start with why he sat down at all. Because the story of how this interview came together is almost as revealing as the interview itself. By November 2019, the pressure had become unbearable. Jeffrey Epstein had died in his Manhattan jail cell on August 10th of that year, and the conspiracy theories surrounding his death renewed attention on everyone in his orbit. Virginia Giuffre had been publicly alleging for years that she was trafficked to Prince Andrew on 3 occasions when she was 17. Every royal engagement generated questions. The strategy of dignified silence wasn't working anymore. So Amanda Thirsk made a decision. Thirsk was Andrew's private secretary, the head of his small personal office within the royal household. According to reporting from Vanity Fair, The Guardian, and BBC producer Sam McAllister's book, Scoops, Thirsk had become convinced that Andrew could explain away the concerns if given the opportunity to speak directly. She believed that he could, essentially, charm his way out. This assessment was catastrophically wrong, but it reflected something important. Thirsk had watched Andrew operate in environments where his status commanded deference. She had never seen what would happen when that deference was removed. The BBC's Newsnight team had been pursuing the interview for months. Sam McAllister, the producer who would eventually secure it, had made the pursuit something of a personal mission. The negotiations were delicate, conducted primarily through Thirsk, with meetings taking place at Buckingham Palace itself. McAllister understood something crucial about how to approach the royal household. You don't demand access. You create the conditions where they believe access serves their interests. The negotiations unfolded over multiple sessions, each one carefully choreographed. McAllister would later describe these meetings in her book, detailing the surreal experience of taking tea in the palace while discussing the logistics of what would become the most catastrophic royal interview in modern history. The settings were designed to reassure: fine china, formal service, the physical trappings of royal hospitality deployed to make the BBC team feel like guests rather than journalists. The implicit message was clear: we are granting you a privilege, and you should be grateful. What Thirsk and Andrew's team failed to understand was that McAllister was playing a longer game. She recognized that every element of hospitality was also an element of intelligence. Each meeting revealed more about how Andrew's circle thought, what they believed would work, where their blind spots lay. The royal team was performing confidence. McAllister was taking notes. The offer was carefully constructed, no questions off limits, no pre-approval of topics. A genuine interview, not a publicity exercise. But the framing was everything. McAllister, according to her subsequent accounts, deliberately led with appeals to Andrew's sense that he could control the narrative. The interview was positioned not as an interrogation, but as an opportunity, a chance for the Duke to put his version of events on the record, to address the swirling allegations directly, to demonstrate the composed dignity that the royal family was known for. This framing worked precisely because it aligned with how Andrew already saw himself. He wasn't a suspect being questioned. He was a senior royal graciously agreeing to clear up some unfortunate misunderstandings. The interview was a favor he was doing for the public, not a risk he was taking with his reputation. Princess Beatrice accompanied her father to the recording on November 14, 2019. She sat off camera during the interview as moral support, having attended at least some of the preparation sessions and reportedly supported her father's decision to participate. Think about that for a moment. His daughter believed in him enough to be present. She watched him destroy himself in real time, unable to intervene as he wandered deeper into the minefield, answer by answer. Senior personnel in the royal household, according to the Times, advised against it. The conventional wisdom was clear. Don't submit to uncontrolled questioning about Epstein. Nothing good can come from it. The palace press operation, which had decades of experience managing royal exposure to media, understood something that Andrew's inner circle did not. An interview is not a conversation. It's a performance, and performances can fail. Andrew and Thirsk overruled these concerns. Here's what makes that decision so revealing. They weren't stupid. They weren't unaware of the risks in the abstract. But they had spent so long inside an echo chamber where Andrew's explanations were accepted without challenge that they confused the absence of pushback with the presence of a convincing case. His stories had always worked before. Why wouldn't they work now? The answer, of course, was that his stories had never actually been tested. They had been accepted because challenging a prince requires a kind of social courage that most people in his orbit did not possess. Thirsk had watched him explain away concerns in private settings, seen heads nod, seen the subject change. She interpreted this as evidence that his explanations were persuasive. What she had actually witnessed was deference performing the role of agreement. The preparation itself was telling. Andrew had talking points. He had explanations ready. But no one in his circle had played the role of skeptical interrogator. No one had asked the follow-up questions that would expose the contradictions. They had prepared him to deliver statements, not to defend them. Now let's examine those statements. Because the interview's enduring power comes from specific moments where Andrew's words contradict either each other, basic logic, or both. These aren't subjective assessments about tone or body language. They're verifiable inconsistencies, mathematical proofs. Contradiction 1. The New York visit. Maitlis pressed Andrew on why he visited Epstein at his New York mansion in December 2010. This was after Epstein had already served time for soliciting a minor for prostitution. The conviction was public. The crime was known. Andrew's explanation was that he flew to New York specifically to end the friendship in person. Doing so by telephone or letter, he said, didn't seem the right thing to do. He described this as the honorable course of action. A face-to-face conversation to say, look, I'm sorry, but we can't be seen together. Stop the tape. If you fly transatlantic to tell someone you can't be seen with them anymore because of their criminal conviction, what do you do after delivering that message? You leave. You book a hotel. You say goodbye. You catch the next flight home. What Andrew actually did was stay at Epstein's mansion for multiple days, as a house guest. He attended a dinner party there. He was photographed walking with Epstein in Central Park during the visit. When Maitlis asked why he didn't simply book a hotel, Andrew explained it was a convenient place to stay. Watch the footage again. Watch Maitlis's face. The slightest flicker of disbelief. She doesn't challenge him aggressively. She doesn't need to. The contradiction exists on its own, fully formed. He flew there to end things because being seen together was impossible. Then he stayed at the man's house and strolled through one of the most public parks in America with him. Both cannot be true simultaneously. He offered both in the same answer. Contradiction 2. Too honorable. This might be the most meaned moment of the entire interview. When Maitlis asked why he maintained contact with Epstein even after the 2008 conviction, Andrew offered a character defense that became instantly infamous. His exact words? "I admit fully that my judgment was probably colored by my tendency to be too honorable, but that's just the way it is." Too honorable. Let that phrase sit for a moment. Prince Andrew was claiming that his character flaw, the weakness that led him to keep socializing with a registered sex offender, was an excess of virtue. He was simply too good a person, too loyal a friend, too committed to doing the right thing. And unfortunately, this surplus of nobility manifested as staying at the Manhattan mansion of a man convicted of sex crimes involving minors. The statement contradicts every established fact of what he actually did. The honorable thing, by any conventional understanding, would have been to end the friendship immediately after the 2008 conviction. He didn't. He visited in 2010. By his own admission, he only ended the relationship after the Central Park photos created a PR problem. The honor he describes is entirely self-declared and contradicted by his own timeline. Contradiction 3. The memory pattern. Throughout the interview, Andrew's denials regarding Virginia Giuffre followed a precise linguistic pattern, one that audiences instinctively recognized as evasive, even if they couldn't articulate why. He repeatedly stated that he had no recollection of meeting her, no memory of the encounter, no photograph that he could recall being taken. Count them as you watch. No recollection, no memory. I don't remember. I can't recall. What he never said, in 49 minutes of footage, was the simple, declarative statement that would be the natural response to a false accusation. I would never do that. It's impossible. It didn't happen. The distinction matters legally. Memory-based denials leave room for events to have occurred without the speaker's current recollection. They're hedged. A man falsely accused of serious misconduct would be expected to respond with outrage and categorical denial, not with careful epistemological qualifications about the limits of memory. Each time Andrew said, "no recollection," he was technically not lying, even if the events did occur. He was only speaking to his mental state rather than to objective reality. The accumulation of these qualified denials speaks for itself. With each addition, the gap between his language and what an innocent person would say widens into a chasm. Contradiction 4. The sweating impossibility. Virginia Giuffre had described dancing with Prince Andrew at Tramp nightclub in London. She noted that he was sweating profusely. This detail became part of the public narrative. Andrew's response was one of the most bizarre moments in the interview. He claimed he could not have been sweating because he had a medical condition that prevented perspiration. The condition, he explained, was a result of his service in the Falklands War in 1982, where he served as a helicopter pilot. He described having experienced an overdose of adrenaline during the conflict, which had damaged his body's ability to sweat. He stated that he only regained the ability to perspire in the last few years after treatment, and that at the time of the alleged nightclub encounter, it was almost impossible for him to have been sweating. Let's examine the medical claim itself, because it deserves forensic scrutiny. The condition Andrew appears to be describing is anhydrosis, the inability to sweat. It's a real medical condition. People do suffer from it, but the causes are well documented in dermatological literature: nerve damage, skin disorders, genetic conditions, certain medications, or damage to sweat glands from burns or radiation. What does not appear in any medical literature is adrenaline overdose from combat stress as a cause of permanent sweat gland dysfunction. Adrenaline, epinephrine, is a hormone produced naturally by the body during stress. It can temporarily reduce sweating by redirecting blood flow away from the skin toward muscles and vital organs. This is basic fight-or-flight physiology. But the effect is temporary, hours at most. The idea that a single period of elevated adrenaline nearly 40 years earlier would permanently disable the sweat glands is not supported by any known medical mechanism. No medical documentation has ever been produced to support this condition. No statements from physicians, no records. Andrew simply asserted it, apparently expecting the claim to be accepted on royal authority. But here's the real problem. Andrew also claimed he wasn't at Tramp nightclub that night at all. He was, he said, at Pizza Express in Woking with his daughter. If he wasn't there, his ability to sweat is irrelevant. If the sweating matters, he's implicitly conceding presence. You cannot need both alibis simultaneously. Either you weren't there, in which case, who cares about your sweat glands, or the sweating matters, in which case you're admitting you were at the nightclub and building a secondary defense. He offered both, in the same interview, and neither holds up to scrutiny. Contradiction 5. The photograph. The photograph that defines this scandal shows Prince Andrew with his arm around Virginia Giuffre's waist. Ghislaine Maxwell is visible in the background. Giuffre was 17 at the time. The image has been examined by multiple forensic experts and has not been found to show signs of manipulation. Andrew's approach was to cast doubt on its authenticity. He suggested it might have been photoshopped. He questioned whether the hand visible around Giuffre's waist was actually his hand. Something about the fingers, he said, didn't look right. He observed that he wasn't someone who habitually hugged people in that manner. This backfired for several reasons. The photograph has been authenticated. No credible evidence of manipulation has ever been produced. He was claiming a forgery that experts had already ruled out. And if the photograph was genuine but he simply didn't remember it being taken, that would align with his no recollection defense. But by claiming possible fakery, he was making a much stronger and much less plausible claim. The desperation was visible. Every explanation contradicted some other explanation. Now we need to talk about Emily Maitlis, because what she did in that interview deserves its own analysis. Traditional confrontational interviewing assumes the subject is prepared with talking points, and the interviewer's job is to disrupt them through aggressive challenge. Maitlis employed the opposite technique. Call it strategic hospitality. She created space for Andrew to speak at length, to elaborate, to volunteer information that hadn't been requested. Her silences after his answers were often several seconds long, pauses that a more experienced subject would recognize as invitations to stop talking. Andrew interpreted them as invitations to continue explaining. He would finish an answer, encounter silence, and then, unable to tolerate the void, add more detail. Each addition dug the hole deeper. Watch her facial expressions. She maintains a studied neutrality that occasionally cracks into what can only be described as suppressed disbelief. When Andrew claimed he couldn't sweat, her expression flickered, almost imperceptibly, toward the reaction any reasonable person would have to such a claim. But she didn't voice that reaction. She simply moved to the next question. The questions themselves were crafted to be open-ended. Rather than asking, "Did you know Epstein was a sex offender when you visited him in 2010?" a yes/no question that could be answered briefly, she asked questions that invited narrative. Tell me about that visit. What was the purpose? These constructions required Andrew to build explanations, and every explanation he built contained load-bearing contradictions that collapsed under their own weight. Maitlis had prepared for months. Every detail of the timeline, every public statement Andrew had made, every piece of evidence that existed. She entered the room knowing more about the chronology than Andrew apparently knew himself. When he offered an explanation, she often had the follow-up question ready, but she deployed it gently, almost conversationally. She let him walk into it rather than driving him toward it. The cumulative effect was an interview where the subject destroyed himself while the interviewer appeared to be simply listening. This technique only works when the subject lacks self-awareness about how they're being perceived, when they can't read the room, when their experience hasn't prepared them for scrutiny. For Andrew, decades of royal protection had created exactly this vulnerability. He had been interviewed countless times, but never challenged. He had no instinct for recognizing when he was losing. In September 2024, Maitlis reflected publicly on the aftermath. She noted that Andrew lost the respect of the nation following the broadcast. Her assessment was clinical rather than triumphant. She had simply done her job, asked questions, waited. The destruction was entirely self-inflicted. Now let's talk about Pizza Express Woking, because this deserves a full forensic examination. This single reference achieved a unique cultural status that transcended the interview itself. It became an instant meme, shorthand for unbelievable alibis, a phrase that will follow Prince Andrew for the rest of his life. The context was Maitlis asking about the specific night in March 2001 when Virginia Giuffre alleges she was trafficked to Prince Andrew in London. Andrew's response was that he couldn't have been with Giuffre that evening because he had taken his daughter, Princess Beatrice, to a birthday party at Pizza Express in Woking. Think about the elements of this alibi for a moment. A prince of the realm, at a chain restaurant, in Woking, not London, not Windsor, but Woking, a commuter town in Surrey with a population of around 100,000, on a specific date, in March 2001, nearly 18 years before the interview. And he remembers it with perfect clarity. The geographical choice was itself remarkable. Woking is approximately 25 miles southwest of London. It's the kind of place you pass through on a train to somewhere else. It has a shopping center, a theater, some decent schools. What it doesn't have is any obvious connection to royal life. The idea that Prince Andrew would have a crystal-clear memory of eating pizza there, of all places, while having no recollection of meeting Virginia Giuffre, struck audiences as not just implausible, but almost satirically unbelievable. The specificity was the problem. Maitlis asked how he could possibly remember a single evening at a pizza restaurant, almost 2 decades later. Andrew's response was that taking his daughter to Pizza Express was unusual for him. It was very unusual for me to go there, and therefore it had stuck in his memory. But this explanation created its own contradiction. If going to Pizza Express was so unusual that it remained memorable 18 years later, why was he there at all? And if the evening was memorable because it was unusual, why did he describe it as a simple birthday party, one of the most ordinary childhood activities imaginable? The alibi asks you to believe 2 incompatible things. First, that the evening was so mundane, a children's birthday party at a pizza chain, that it proves Andrew was living an ordinary domestic life rather than meeting with anyone connected to Epstein. Second, that the evening was so exceptional that he remembers it with precision 18 years later. Ordinary events don't create lasting memories. That's why eyewitness testimony about routine activities is notoriously unreliable. What did you have for dinner on the 3rd Tuesday of March 18 years ago? You have no idea. Nobody would. But Andrew claimed to know. Pizza Express, Woking, birthday party, March 2001. The public reaction was immediate and brutal. Within hours of the broadcast, Pizza Express Woking was trending across social media platforms worldwide. The restaurant's Woking branch was flooded with joke reviews on TripAdvisor and Google, people claiming to have seen the Duke of York there, expressing mock surprise that royalty frequented their local pizza joint, suggesting the restaurant should erect a commemorative plaque. One reviewer gave 5 stars specifically because, "If it's good enough for a prince, it's good enough for me." Another claimed the restaurant had a royal atmosphere. The jokes wrote themselves. The branch became a tourist destination of sorts. People took selfies outside. News crews showed up. The absurdity of the alibi had transformed a nondescript restaurant in a nondescript Surrey town into a landmark of British cultural memory. You couldn't say Pizza Express Woking anymore without everyone in the room knowing exactly what you meant. Pizza Express as a company found itself in an impossible position. They hadn't asked to become a punchline in a royal scandal. They issued no official statement. What could they possibly say? The association was now permanent. Marketing executives presumably had meetings about this. Brand managers presumably lost sleep. There was no response that wouldn't make it worse. Silence was the only option, and even silence kept the joke alive. A novelty song appeared within days of the broadcast, mocking both Andrew's inability to sweat and his Pizza Express alibi. It reached number 20 in the UK charts. People were literally buying music about a prince's unbelievable claim to have been eating margarita in Woking while alleged crimes occurred in London. The deeper problem with the alibi wasn't just its specificity. It was the selectivity of Andrew's memory. Throughout the interview, he claimed to have no recollection of meeting Virginia Giuffre, no memory of the photograph being taken, no recall of any of the events she described. His defense was built on the absence of memory, the careful hedging that lawyers use when they want to avoid perjury while not actually denying anything. But suddenly, when it came to his alibi, memory was crystal clear. Pizza Express, Woking, birthday party, March 2001. The human brain doesn't work this way. We don't forget potentially life-altering encounters while retaining perfect recall of pizza dinners. The selectivity exposed the strategy. Memory was absent when it needed to be absent. Memory was present when it needed to be present. The convenience was too complete. Maitlis didn't press him aggressively on this contradiction. She didn't need to. She let the alibi sit there, in all its absurdity, and moved on. The audience could do the math themselves. The Pizza Express alibi became a case study in how not to construct a defense. Lawyers analyzing the interview afterward noted that an effective alibi needs documentation, not just assertion. Credit card receipts, photographs, witnesses. Andrew offered none of these. He offered only his memory, the same memory that conveniently failed him whenever the questions got difficult. Had he simply said, "I don't recall where I was that evening," it would have been consistent with his general defense of non-memory. Disappointing, but not damning. Instead, he volunteered a specific location, a specific activity, and a specific explanation for why he remembered it. He turned a potential non-answer into a testable claim, and the claim failed the test of basic plausibility. Within days of the broadcast, Prince Andrew announced he was stepping back from royal duties for the foreseeable future. The statement acknowledged the interview had become a major disruption to the royal family's work. His public engagements were canceled. His charities began distancing themselves. The implosion was total. But the consequences didn't end with his resignation from public life. They were just beginning. In August 2021, Virginia Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit against Prince Andrew in New York federal court, alleging sexual assault. The lawsuit relied heavily on the Newsnight interview, not as evidence of what happened, but as evidence of Andrew's credibility. His contradictions, his absurd alibis, his careful non-denials were all cited in legal filings. The interview he had given to clear his name had become the primary weapon used against him. Andrew's legal team initially attempted to have the case dismissed on technical grounds. They argued that Giuffre's 2009 settlement with Epstein released Andrew from liability. They questioned the court's jurisdiction. They employed every procedural defense available. What they could not do was put Andrew on the witness stand. The prospect of Andrew being deposed, of being questioned under oath by Giuffre's lawyers, would have been catastrophic. His Newsnight performance had demonstrated exactly how he responded to questioning. Cross-examination by hostile attorneys would have been orders of magnitude more aggressive than Maitlis's careful, patient approach. Every contradiction from the interview would have been thrown back at him. Every claim about Pizza Express and sweating and the photograph would have been dissected. In February 2022, Prince Andrew settled the lawsuit. The amount was not disclosed, but reports from multiple outlets, including the Telegraph and the Daily Mail, estimated it at approximately £12 million. The settlement included no admission of wrongdoing, but it removed any possibility of Andrew testifying. It removed any possibility of further clips, further contradictions, further evidence of how badly he performed when asked to explain himself. The settlement was widely interpreted as an acknowledgement that Andrew could not survive legal scrutiny. His own interview had proven that. A man who had talked himself into disaster on sympathetic national television could not be trusted to survive hostile cross-examination in an American courtroom. The settlement also required Andrew to make a donation to Giuffre's charity supporting victims' rights. In his accompanying statement, he acknowledged that Epstein trafficked countless young girls over many years and expressed regret for his association with the convicted sex offender. The statement was carefully worded to avoid any admission of personal wrongdoing, but it represented a complete reversal from the confident denials of the Newsnight interview. The interview footage, meanwhile, continued to circulate. It became a staple of YouTube reaction videos, podcast discussions, journalism school case studies on interview technique. Netflix commissioned a film about how the interview came together, titled Scoop, based on Sam McAllister's book, that would dramatize the negotiations, the preparation, the recording, and the fallout. Gillian Anderson was cast as Emily Maitlis. The interview had become an artifact of cultural history, a text to be studied. It would outlive everyone involved. Here's what makes this interview compulsively rewatchable, what brings people back to it years later, what generates analysis videos and reaction compilations. It's not the scandal itself. People already knew about Epstein. They already had opinions about Andrew. What the interview captured was something rarer, the precise moment when privilege meets accountability, after a lifetime of protection. The disconnect between his self-perception and reality was so total that he genuinely seemed to believe he was winning while obviously losing. You can see it in his face, the confidence, the certainty that his explanations are landing. That gap between self-perception and reality is both darkly hilarious and deeply satisfying. This is a man who has never had to convince anyone of anything, because agreement was always assumed. His stories always worked because no one with power ever challenged them. And now, suddenly, someone is simply asking follow-up questions. Just basic journalism. And he has no defense. The interview isn't just cringe, it's catharsis. For everyone who's ever been held accountable while watching the protected class skate by. For everyone who's ever had to explain themselves while the powerful simply waved concerns away. For everyone who suspected that this kind of privilege creates a certain kind of obliviousness. Here was proof. Filmed proof. In the south drawing room of Buckingham Palace, a man so accustomed to deference that he couldn't recognize its absence, a man who confused having stories with having answers. A man who had spent a lifetime being told he was right, and who therefore walked directly into the trap that silence creates for liars. Emily Maitlis didn't destroy Prince Andrew. She just stopped protecting him. And it turned out, that was all it took. Subscribe for more stories like this.